Thank you, Mike. Welcome all to the webinar today. Thank you for joining. I'd like to thank all the branches and all of you who have taken time to join this webinar. Texas ASCE is a state association for civil engineers, and we're happy to provide this service to the engineering community. And if you're not a member of ASCE and the Texas section, we sure invite you to join and believe it can be a great benefit to you throughout your professional career. Now I'm pleased to give an introduction to our presenter for today's webinar, Glenn Fox. Glenn has been in the subsurface utility engineering, or SUE, and utility mapping industry for 33 years. He's the director of SUE for CP&Y in Plano, Texas. He was a field technician for the first 12 years of his career and has spent the last 21 years as a project or department manager. He has done SUE work in 12 states and the District of Columbia, including such high-profile projects as the Walter Reed Army Medical Center and the Little Rock Air Force Base. He managed a number of notable projects for SUE activity related to the I-35 West North Tarrant Expressway project in Fort Worth, the 12-inch reuse line for the Star and Frisco, high-speed rail, and at TCU at Love Field and the Hess gas plant in Seminole. He's published SUE and utility mapping articles in several magazines, including Underground Focus, Pipeline and Gas Journal, Trenchless Technology, Utility Contractor, Damage Preventive, Texas 811, Lone Star 811, and the survey magazine Point of Beginning. He's actively supporting our industry by serving on a number of committees including the National Utility Locating Contractors Association, Locator Committee, the Utility of Virginia Standards Committee regarding the marking system, and the Utility Engineering and Surveying Institute of ASCE's Committee on Subsurface Utility Engineering and Investigation. He also has served as a judge for 6 years at the International Locate Rodeo in Macon in Atlanta, Georgia. Now I'd like to ask Glenn to proceed with his presentation.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. That makes me sound very old. Today I'd just like to discuss the importance of understanding the quality of utility records and the utility mapping that you're looking at when you get a deliverable from somebody. Bob kind of hit most of my experience there. As he said, I've been doing this for a long time for a variety of different folks. It was something that was on the humorous side. About 20 years ago, I was skiing with my wife, and as we were riding up the chairlift, I started looking around, and finally she asked me what the heck I was doing, and I told her that I was trying to figure out where the snow blower machines were being fed from. And so at that point in time, she told me to stop thinking about underground utilities and enjoy the beautiful mountain scenery. So kind of from that down, it's been determined that I have the condition called utilititis. I don't think it's contagious. The agenda for today, we'll talk about the marking of utilities. We'll talk about, again, the interpretation of records and marks in the field and why they're so important. But understanding how the utilities are marked by the one-call system, showing you numerous examples of record drawings and their level of accuracy and or just not being clear in general. And then really just trying to impress the need for quality level B for accurate utility mapping as opposed to other alternatives that folks may be using. I'm sure everybody is probably familiar with the one-call system. My intent today is not to knock the one-call system. but just to kind of maybe explain a little bit more to folks who might not be completely familiar with how things work. The one call guys have a very tough job. These folks are typically asked to show up to 30 to 40 different sites a day and mark anywhere from one to multiple utilities in a very short period of time. I'm sure also, as most people have experienced, they probably had some issues with getting folks to mark the lines if they're calling a design ticket or even for excavation, as well as lines being mismarked. A lot of engineers use the survey or the design ticket. This is a free service. The issue there might be is that there might be 6 owners that show up on the ticket, but it's pretty typical for only 3 or 4 of the owners to actually come out there and mark their lines. Some may even call or may even respond to the ticket and say there's no conflict because they know there's going to be no excavation. So these tickets are very low priority. This info can be really misleading. Folks then sometimes send out a survey crew to pick those marks, and if one or 2 or 3 of the utility owners locators has decided to just clear the ticket, then when that information comes in on the topo, there might be some utility info that's missing. So as well as that, there won't be any private utility information on there if there's any services or any private lines. I've seen on numerous occasions the folks that mark for water and sewer owners, because their lines aren't traceable, they'll just come out into the field with a paint stick and eyeball their lines. They don't use any equipment. So with all that said, if I was a designer, I certainly wouldn't have a very good comfort level. And the intent here again is just to impress the need to always at least request records. The interpretation of the records is another issue. If you call in a design ticket and have surveyors collect those marks are considered quality level D, which is the lowest quality level. Now, even though one call folks use, for the most part, the same equipment as a SUE person, there are several reasons that the ASCE doesn't necessarily trust the accuracy of that information, and that's for several reasons. They don't trust that those folks have been properly trained, and they don't trust that the equipment has been maintained or is regularly calibrated. This often leads to some very bad results, and the reason for that is just experience from many folks. As you can see in the marks there, in the pictures, the picture on the left is really confusing. If you were to go out there in the field and see the electric mark in the red in the center of that island, and then you have a phone duct mark right at the curb line. Well, one's on top of each other. Well, it's a pretty good chance that those aren't on top of each other. As you look a little bit to the right, you have another set of phone duct marks, and the gas guys marked on top of the phone. So again, I think it would be pretty unlikely that those 2 lines are buried in the same trench. That really makes it tough then for someone to distinguish, what's good and what's not good. A little bit different if a SUE company is marking, they're typically using a different and more of a standard mark, whether it's a mark or a flag, and they're more uniform. The one call folks use a variety of different symbols, as you can see here. You got 2 lines with a diamond in the middle, you got 2 lines with an arrow in the middle. Over here you have an arrow. So there's all kinds of different symbologies that are used. Typically that's just because a particular locator wants to have a unique mark, so he knows that he marked it. But if you are the person that's trying to interpret that, it can make it very difficult. There are very often misleading marks out in the field. In this case, crossing an entrance to a neighborhood, the person marking the electric ducts there has 14 separate marks going across the curb line, and approximately about 12 feet wide there. Well, there's pretty slim chance that there's that many cables now that are that spread apart. You'd be much more likely to find, if you were to dig a hole there, something like in the picture below it, where there's just a couple of conduits, where I have these red lines here, and not more than probably 3 or 4 feet across. So again, if you are excavating, designing there, it'd be some very conflicting information, very deceiving, I should say, information. So more confusing marks, similar to the ones on previous slide. Electric marked on top of phone. Again, this one's a little clearer picture of what we just looked at, but I just came across this the other day, and I was just trying to figure out, wow, what the heck is going on here? How did somebody do this? Again, there's a variety of different marks, whether they're trying to indicate the 3 lines on the red are trying to indicate primary electric. The marks with the diamond in the middle, are they trying to indicate a duct bank or just a single duct? Again, very, very, very confusing if you're out there trying to interpret what's going on. Another example of the utility congestion and an issue that everyone faces, be it a utility locator, a one-call locator, a SU technician, or a designer, is congestion. This actually is right outside of my office, where I think there's 10 different fiber optic owners who have structures all very close to each other. And it's just a congested nightmare out there. If you were to try and interpret all the marks, and some of the marks are a little faded there in the picture, but again, it's extremely confusing. I think even if you were to ask and request records from these folks, you would get a wide variety of accuracy of records, anything from maybe just an orange line on a Google Earth map to possibly an as-built that gave you a distance back of curb. But it would be very tough to compile all that information because all levels of accuracy would be so different. There'd be a lot of interpretation is needed there. And again, kind of the reason for this presentation today is to just focus on the issues of interpreting records and field marks, so that a designer can have accurate utility information to work from. Another picture in a very similar area. Just sometimes it's amazing to me how many lines are in the ground in some of these areas. Oftentimes these multi-owner duct banks will have lines that are running together in the same duct bank. In this case, while the structures are close together, the lines spread out for almost 30 feet, almost from the back of the curb, 30 feet behind it. So really, again, if you're using a design ticket or don't have an SUE person or hire an SUE firm to map all this stuff, you could get a wide range of utility mapping to use. In this picture, I'm illustrating the difference between how a SUE firm would mark lines as opposed to one-call folks. On the right, again, is a mess of one-call marks where there's either 3 or 4 fiber owners who have just painted on top of each other. Very confusing to look at. And on the right, on the left, is more of how a SU firm would mark the lines. So they'd mark them all lined up with each other, and then you can see how they all line up. And it's much easier for someone to go out and interpret what's going on in these locations. You're going to get a much better product in the end, much easier to figure out what's going on. This slide is an example of a phone company drawing. Now, this is something that they typically don't provide anymore. This is an older drawing, but you can see there's a lot of information on it. And if you weren't familiar with these types of drawings or didn't have any kind of legend, it'd be very, very difficult to transfer this kind of record drawing into a topographic file that had phone manhole and phone pads. It'd be very difficult to connect those structures. I think a big question that I always have when somebody sends me a file and they have utility lines shown on it, the first thing I always ask is, where did this information come from? Was it compiled by, you know, a junior engineer, an EIT, by a CAD person? How did they come up with it? So to me, that's just really critical to know that up front. You can get some very, very misleading information on these types of drawings. There are some very obvious symbols, such as B, to indicate buried, but then unless you know some of the codes to tell you if the line is overhead or buried, the size of the line, distances between structures, etc., it's very difficult to incorporate this information into a topographic drawing. The slide here is a newer version, or what some of the phone companies are now providing, either SU firms, engineers, whoever requests them. And while the other one was a little confusing to look at, it was in this similar schematic format, but it gave you a lot of good information. And once you get familiar with those, they're fairly simple to figure out. Newer drawings that they're giving, providing folks are very, very inaccurate. While this one may show 3 lines on the lower side of the road, there actually may be 5, and on the other side of the road where they show 6 lines, there may only be 2. Where they show structures, I don't know how many cases we've had recently where these structures are anywhere from 100 to 400 feet off. So again, if you're trying to equate this information into a topographic drawing, it's going to be really hard to represent it very accurately. It's kind of amazing that this information, or the way that they recorded their information now. It's obviously a secrecy thing, but it really makes it tough for anybody who has to use this record drawing and is worried about utility conflict. The drawing on this slide is I guess you would say close to humorous. We had a project in the southwestern part of the state, and the water. This is what the water owner provided us. They show a dash line that they call it a 2-inch water running along one side of the road, and then it crosses the road. And so this drawing actually in scale covered well over a mile. Luckily, it was only for a 2-inch water line, so it wasn't anything that was critical or that would be hard to relocate. But it wasn't traceable. It was plastic, and it was just amazing and surprising for a utility owner to provide a drawing of this level of accuracy, or I should say of lack of accuracy. As it ended up, once we pushed them a little further, the client felt that it was going to be in conflict with some culverts they were extending along this road. The water owner at that point in time came forward and said, well, the water line is outside of the right of way other than where it crosses the road. So initially, while the client had us digging probably 10 test holes on it, almost all of them went away other than at the point of crossing. Just a very interesting example of some of the information that that you get from folks. I have another example of a record drawing from an electric owner. Now that's a pretty nice drawing. It shows everything what appears to be pretty accurate and pretty detailed as far as manholes and transformer and switch gear. And so a client requested this of the electric company, and this is what they were provided. They took this information, and this in the two red lines with UE on it, it was their interpretation, and I'll go back so you can see it again, of these two lines that cross the road here. So their interpretation was pretty reasonable and pretty realistic, and they were ready to start their design based on this. But then we were asked to go out and actually map the utilities ourselves, and the line was over 100 feet off, as well as the alignment, as you can see, was drastically different than how the record showed it and how the owner depicted it. What this ended up doing was they were going to do some work on the drainage here and down in these inlets, and by finding the line where we did find it, it ended up saving them a couple of test holes. So I can impress enough the importance of using somebody, SUE provider, to get you accurate mapping as opposed to relying on the call system or utility company records. I have another good example of some bad information. We had a client give us coordinates. They wanted 2 test holes on a gas main. They were going to widen the road here. They were going to add another lane, and they were going to add another inlet. So on the 2 circles here, they asked is where they thought the location of this gas line was. Our crews went out, staked those locations out, but before they dug, they pulled their equipment out to mark the line, and they found it 16 feet off. So as it turned out, they didn't need the holes. They ended up, because they thought for sure their information was correct, they asked us to excavate the holes anyway. We did just confirm the line, but had they requested a quality level B initially, as opposed to quality level A, they probably could have gotten information they needed in for about half the price. I think when people see utility record, or when they see marks in the field put down by the one call folks, they take it as the gospel, and a lot of times the information is very inaccurate. This drawing here is from the Railroad Commission, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Railroad Commission is actually a great website, has tons of good information. But with that said, there's so many pipelines crossing Texas that it's close to impossible, I'm sure, to keep inventory and an accurate map of all of them. I've come across two instances where I've found issues. One, Railroad Commission indicated 3 lines. This was crossing a brand new roadway, so we were asked to excavate on those 3 lines. As it turned out, there was only evidence, there was only signals, there was only marker posts on 2 lines. I went back to the Railroad Commission and let them know that, and upon a little further investigation, they determined that the person that added the information to the drawing had accidentally duplicated one of the lines, so they ended up removing a line. They probably showed a mapping for about 5 miles. We also, I also just recently went on a project south of Houston in kind of what I would call a pipeline alley area. Railroad Commission showed 8 lines crossing our project. As it turns out, we found 11. There was one owner who was not identified, and 2 of the owners had multiple lines where they showed 1 line. So again, no intent here to knock the Railroad Commission. It's a great resource. It's a great website. But the point is just to not necessarily believe everything you see on paper. So something that I've found that I think has definitely hampered my efforts at times is getting a topo that doesn't call out a structure correctly. And so if I'm trying to add utilities to a drawing and the information I have is very vague, it makes it tough. So while typically most surveyors are not trained to be utility structure experts, you know, sometimes you'll see call out of a, you know, green box or utility manhole. Well, that's not always very helpful if there's multiple utilities in the area and you're trying to connect the dots. The structure on the very left of the screen there is actually a vent pipe on an irrigation system. This is down south where irrigation systems, and I'm not talking about a residential system. I'm talking about a large system with 18 to 36-inch pipes connecting some orange groves and such. I had never seen a structure like this. The topo, in fact, it didn't even show up. I think they just ignored it. Luckily, our guys sent us a picture and say, "Hey, what's this?" And we looked up, and sure enough, it's a vent pipe or a vent on an irrigation system, and it actually lined right up with some of the records. So it made it much more accurate for us to add our line in there on a line that wasn't traceable. There are some unique structures out there. This is a little like a weather station for irrigation system in a neighborhood. The silver cabinet there is just the electric for it. I believe on the topo that we got for this, that was called a transformer. So again, if you're trying to add records and connect lines with structures that are labeled wrong, it makes it tough. I've worked on a couple projects recently where we were in the QA stage and we were trying to we were comparing record drawings with what field crew found, and the topo called out a gas meter vent pipe. That's something that I had never heard of and didn't really understand. Sure enough, what it turned out to be was just vent pipes on underground storage tanks for a gas station. So sometimes I think when folks don't know what to call it out, they take their best guess, they take a stab, and often it's not very accurate. On the same project, we had a structure called out a water meter vent pipe. Again, it was something that I'd never heard of, never seen anybody call out such a thing. And as it turned out, it was an air release on a force main. So I think my point here is if you have a topo and you see something doesn't look right or they call it out kind of funky, there are times when Street View will help you out and you can resolve what structure is. But I'm sure, as all of you have found out, sometimes the Street View is old or the photography in some areas, rural areas, is not as good and it's tough to figure out. So it often though will save a return trip to the field or questions that come up. Again, more on utility structures and the correct identification of them. A lot of times I've seen structures like these, again, called out as just the infamous green box. Some are labeled pretty good. In this case, the owner's labeled. It's always good that the surveyors or whoever's collecting the information knows ownership. But it is really important to get the utility right, whether it's phone, electric, cable TV, whether it's a handhold. Really important that this information is relayed correctly. I've come across a couple interesting, I guess, miscellaneous structures of late. The rock in the upper left-hand picture is actually a fake rock that's sitting over top of a backflow preventer like the one in the lower left here. Not that these are typically an issue with design, but just something I thought that was kind of interesting when we were out doing our QA of the site, and we saw a couple of irrigation structures around it, and then we bumped into the rock and the rock moved. We found out that it was, and there's a market that sells this kind of stuff. I thought that was pretty interesting. Again, the topo ad didn't just call it out as a rock. I had a job where we were in quality level C and D, just adding information per records for a client. And in this structure on the right, this pole here with electric meter was actually called out as a transformer. I was able to street view this area, but that's all I could see was what was this, and it ended up causing a site visit to go out and determine that it was just a meter on a pole and not a transformer. This is a picture of a site where we recently dug test holes. The small silver box down here was not shown in the topo. We added it when we went out there, and this was actually a test station. And in the picture here, it's a location where they can insert their equipment and test the corrosion on the pipe. The concern was that since it wasn't in the topo, was there an anode bed or some other structures underground in this area that we felt it would be very important to let the client know. So having photographed this and then gotten it, sent it to the owner, we were able to determine that it was just a single anode and not a bed and not a string that had 10 anodes and was 50 feet long. But again, just really important that everything gets collected in the field and it gets called out accurately. I'm sure most folks are familiar with G.I.S. Records today are in a G.I.S format. While it all looks great on a computer screen, its intent is really not to be accurate. It's more for inventory purposes and to let you know that there's some there. If you ask anyone who's a surveyor, they will tell you that G.I.S stands for Get It Surveyed, and that's something that I would have to agree with. So please keep in mind if you get records where all the lines are nice and straight, and the accuracy is probably pretty limited. Private utilities are a whole different issue. You go out to sites like a gas plant, like this photo on the left. You don't know what could be out there. Again, these are areas where one call won't mark. So these are areas where, and typically records are of varying degrees of accuracy, if records are even available. A lot of time they're not to scale. The drawing on the right was of a water system at a private facility, but it wasn't to any scale. So unless you're out in the field trying to equate this to the topo and to the design that was going on, it was virtually impossible. I'm going to run through just the general SUE quality levels. Touch on some more SUE specific information briefly. I'm sure everybody's probably already familiar with the quality levels. If not, hit me at the end for any questions. The definitions quickly, just quality level D just involves obtaining record drawings. This is usually more for if you're doing a long corridor and you're running a pipeline or power lines for a long corridor, and you're looking at records in general just to take the least path of resistance. Quality level C is obtaining records from the utility owners and referencing them into a topographic survey. Quality level B is when you would hire a SU provider who will go out and mark the lines, give you horizontal accuracy. And then quality level A, the highest level, is when a vacuum truck is used to actually expose the line and provide the client with X, Y, and Z exact location of that facility. So quality level B is what we've been talking about, though, for the most part today. And I just kind of want to point some of the differences between what a SU technician does as opposed to what a one-call person does. When I spoke earlier that ASCE does not recognize one-call marks as quality level B, it's for a variety of reasons. Typically, the SU tech is trained better. The SU tech, when he goes out to a site, has to mark all types of lines. When a one-call person will typically only mark one utility or maybe few utilities. So one of the huge benefits the SU tech has is they go out in the field with utility records from all the owners. So really you have all the pieces or the majority of the pieces of the puzzle in your hand, as opposed to just having one or two or three. It makes a huge difference. The SU tech also typically has a variety, might have 2, 3, 4 pieces of locating equipment with a variety of frequencies that they can use to help them resolve congested areas or utilities that are poor conductors. One-call person, at least it's been my experience, is typically only sent out in the field with one piece of equipment, so it definitely hampers them a little bit. So while both folks go out and mark utilities, one is typically far more trained and typically far more accurate. The equipment the folks in the SU industry use is the same as the one-call folks. Again, just the training is a little bit different, but some of the challenges for anyone who has to locate utilities are number of connection points, or available connection points, I should say, the material type, the depth of the utility, and utility congestion. Now, these instruments, a lot of time, we're asked to provide an electronic depth. So while these instruments all have that feature, the manufacturer will tell you that the accuracy is plus or minus 10%, but that's in pristine conditions. So that would be in a laboratory. When as soon as you leave the laboratory or walk outside your door and get in the field, I don't consider any of those pristine conditions. So most folks typically do not provide electronic depths for that reason, because their accuracy can be suspect. Field people use them as a guide. So if they are marking a water line and they get a depth of 12 inches, they probably know that they've jumped onto a different conductor. So that the depth function there in the SU industry is really more for interpretative purposes, to say, okay, I have good signal strength, I have a believable depth, I'm on the target conductor. There are other instruments out there. A lot of folks will ask for GPR. They might have seen it on a CSI type show or something like that, where they show an image of a body, or they show some very clear image that they depict that the machinery can see, and that's just not the case. The picture in the lower right-hand corner is a hyperbola, and that's what you see on the screen here on the top of the equipment. Now, for what it's worth, GPR is not very good in North Texas and a good part of the state. It does work pretty good out west, Midland area, or along the coast. GPR has some limitations. So typically we would use only if we can't find a line or if we're specifically asked to use it. There are companies out there like Exxon that want you to do everything you possibly can, almost as an insurance policy and doing your due diligence. So they'll ask for it, but typically I advise folks that it's not going to do them any better or get them any more information than the electromagnetic equipment that we just looked at. There are ways to locate gravity systems or non-conductive systems. There's a tool here in the upper right called a traceable duct rotter that can be inserted into a manhole at the end of a culvert pipe, and you can trace out a line. If you have other connection points, you can insert it and trace and get at find blind connections. This is a spot where this pipe right here was in conflict, and we were able to run the rotter down through it and then dig a test hole. That's a picture of the top of the pipe underneath it. It could also be inserted into empty conduits. Folks have seen this a lot too out in the field where they may be on a site where conduits have been installed for future use or just haven't been utilized yet. So you can insert this rotter into that, trace out the line with very good accuracy. Utility designation. So that is quality level B. There's typically an approach there. The process is to trace a conductor from a known structure to a known structure, such as valve to valve or a manhole to a manhole. You also trace from the best conductor to the worst conductor. So typically you start with something like cable TV, which is a great conductor and very shallow, and then work your way down through phone and electric. Then you get to pipes, which are deeper and not as good conductors, get the gas, water, force main, etc. One of the beauties of being a SUE person as opposed to a one-call locator is to use something called the end information. So if you are trying to trace out a line and you lose the signal, you use the EOI, the end information call out, and then depict that line on your mapping at a different quality level. One call folks are typically have to put a mark down. So even when they get a good signal or they're not confident, they have to put a mark down. So now, again, if a surveyor has to collect those marks, none of that gets back to the engineer or to the designer that says, you know, that this mark was put down with very little confidence. That can be a real issue. The SUE person will also typically provide some kind of field sketch, whether it's hand drawn like this, whether it's electronic using Bluebeam or some other software like that. That's also provided to the folks who are doing the survey as well as the CAD folks and used to compare in the QA process and the end of the project. This is an example of a finished product, calling out quality levels, showing line work. Kind of just a sample there. I'm sure everybody's probably familiar with this and seeing this. Again, this is signed by a PE, and if the quality levels are called out, then it's typically signed by a PE, and this information can be delivered in AutoCAD or MyStation format. Another example of quality level B work. The difference again there, when you see the letter identifiers, you have the quality level D after it, you know that those lines are just shown as per record, so the accuracy is plus or minus. When there is no letter call out, such as like on this T line here, that means that it was designated and it's quality level B, and you can be pretty confident in the accuracy of the line. I just have a few slides left. So if you happen to run into a site where there's non-metallic utilities and they can't be traced, there are still ways to find them. I have on occasion Had a utility owner who had some very accurate records, who had bearing and distance on them. We were able to convert that and stake out a line and find a large 30-inch force main, in this case, the picture on the left. I've also been involved in situations, this was on a college campus, the picture on the right, where there was various empty concrete ducts that the owner knew was there, but they were concerned about them. They didn't want to tear them up. But since they weren't traceable, they had us use a vacuum truck and just dig this long slot trench. And you can see there's 1, 2, 3. I think that was a duct bank down there. So there are other alternatives. And with that, that is the end of the presentation, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
If you have any questions for Glenn, please click on the box and type your questions in. While you're doing that, let me just thank all of you for participating in the call today and the webinar, and particularly thank Glenn Fox for his presentation. If there are any of you that might be interested in presenting a webinar, you can contact Andre Salazar, who's the technical vice president, and his email address is asalazar@walterpmoore.com. asalazar@walterpmoore.com. And you can also visit the webinar web page on the ASCE Texas section website for a list of all upcoming sessions, including the next month one, which is going to be Understanding the Importance of Pavement Preservation on December 17th, and What Does the Survey Say on January 14th. We do have questions, a couple questions here, Glenn. The first one is, what is the depth limitation for the rotor tracing device and how accurate?
That could probably trace anything 10 to 15 feet. Would depend on any other utility congestion there and the soil conditions. 15 feet though would probably be pretty reasonable. Anything past that would be debatable.
All right, and then another question on what kind of legal liability is associated with SUE work? Are there special insurance considerations associated with SUE service?
There's certainly some considerations, but really not much different than a surveyor or an engineer would have. There are certainly notes that everyone adds to their drawing to avoid liability. There are times when there are lines that if you have no indication that they're there, that you're not going to find. And even though you've done your due diligence with a field investigation, you may not be able to find those lines. So you always have to put a disclaimer note in your deliverable to cover your tail.
And then there was another question that's was for ASCE, will a recording of this be provided? And the answer is yes, a recording will be provided along with that will include the presentation slides, and all participants will get an email with a one hour credit. Are there any other questions for Glenn? All right. Well, again, we sure want to thank you, Glenn, for your excellent presentation and good visuals. And I think it was very informative. We got one more question here. Does the SUE technician doing level B use one call first?
We use one call system to identify utility owners. So I think everyone has different preferences. I do not ask one-call folks mark their lines. I prefer my technicians do it, but I do use them to identify all the owners. That is more of a preference thing. Sometimes it makes it very confusing if you have to go out and mark the lines after one call is marked, and then there's two sets of marks. That can be very confusing, all depending who is collecting those marks.
All right, well, thank you.